It's important to realize that geology really is continuing to advance and develop, and that so most people today, when they read their physical science books in the 8th grade, or they read even in college textbooks, they're really not getting all of the views of the current geologists. So for instance, I just picked up Andrew Mall's recent book. It's a graduate level text. I think it's the Geology of Stratigraphic Sequences. And Mall has basically points out at the beginning, very interestingly, the power of paradigms. First chapter, he quotes Kuhn consistently, the power of paradigms to interpret data. He then discusses this tension between the deductive method, this idea of a global framework, how do the rocks develop, versus which is a little more of a traditional inductive, a geologist looking at an outcropping, what are the rocks in a local area? And he discusses the tensions in here. And I think this is what's very interesting. Even now, most people don't realize is that there isn't necessarily a great explanation for why the rocks are there mechanistically. So if you've got, well, why are all these rocks there? They're laid down by water. Well, Steve Austin mentions this, these rising and falling of the seas, these transgression and regression cycles. Well, I mean, Lawrence Sloss, very brilliant geologist, he's the one that began to look at in this case, the continent of North America and say they seem like there are these very clear sequence packages. We call them mega sequences. They're often referred to as Sloss sequences, where you have an unconformity, some major erosional flow, and then you have these sequences where the rocks have a tendency to grade from coarser grains up to finer grains, a sandstone, shale, limestone. It's not perfect. And then another major unconformity. And then they start again. And so he has these 5 sequences. He named them after local Indian tribes in many cases, like the Sauk and the Tippecanoe and things like that. But I think that it's important is the questions like, so how did those get there? And even Mall, I think it's in his 6th chapter, says it's still real hard to understand how these huge continental package sequences could simply be laid down by a slow ocean. And Peter Vail picked these up. He's the Exxon executive with this idea of these, basically of seawater, of sea levels. Now these are still really controversial even among geologists because they say, well, that's curious, but I'm just not necessarily seeing this in the local place, and is this being assumed? And I think that what most people don't realize is that science is not monolithic. You start getting into these graduate level, you realize there's a lot they don't know and are arguing about and concerned about. And so we're back to this point of this, I'm going to take what the textbook says, and well, surely that must be. And most pastors, they don't go get into this. I mean, as a case in point, I was talking to a head of theology at a seminary, and I asked him, I said, well, so what is your view of this? And he said, what's your view of paleontology? And he said, well, I don't have time for that. And I can't talk about paleontology. And I appreciated that. And I said, well, so if you don't believe that the Bible is really, Genesis is really accurate history in terms of this phenomenology, 6 days and a global flood, well, so what actually happened? And he kind of looked at me and said, well, I don't know. And so this is curious. I will ask pastors who deny that, that it's really history in this kind of a young earth, or even a sense of, let's just say, the simple chronology of the text, who they deny that, well, it can't really be 6 days, or these genealogies need to have all these, there's more gaps than there are, people in the genealogies, or the flood is local. And I often ask them, well, so what happened? And they're usually quiet. Well, I don't know. And so I think what's happened is the tendency to take one of these interpretive frameworks, a framework hypothesis, which dehistoricizes the text, meaning it kind of pulls the language away and says, well, it means this framework and these 6 days are really just periods that overlap, and they really can't be used to know anything about time the way we talk about time, or their analogy, they're God's work days. They're not our time, it's His time. These are all, as Jim Jordan says, Gnostic tendencies to pull the language away from the reality. So then the question you're left with is, so what happened to the reality? And then that gets very kind of curious, because all of a sudden they're stuck with having to recreate this reality. Well, the only people that have done a good reality work are the secular guys, the folks who have rejected Genesis. So they're forced to go take them, and they kind of got to, jimmy it around to make it fit. And
so it seems to me that the bottom line of what we're talking about, and going back again to the divide, when you're talking about an economy here, the divide is that on one side, there is, we'll say, a tendency all the way to the absolute notion that the scientific paradigm is true. The scientific paradigm has...
The current scientific paradigm, because I mean, yeah, it could be, once
current.
that changes...
That's right, it's temporary, it's current, but that paradigm is, we'll just say it's absolutely true, it's true. And so therefore we need to understand the scripture in the light of that, as opposed to beginning with the assumption that the scripture is true, as it is apparently written in a historical genre, and then we try to understand the physical world in the light of that. So that's basically the two positions here in what we would call the dichotomy that we're looking at.